Lonely Rancher paid $1 for women with sack on head, but when she spoke, he froze. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Montana Territory, spring of 1887. The settlement of Red Bluff clung to the edge of the pines, where the dirt trail split beneath heavy wagon wheels and the roots of old trees. Dust drifted as though it had forgotten where else to settle. Cook smoke crawled low across the street, and the smell of horse sweat, pine pitch, and stale tobacco lived in every board of the town. At the far end of the square, someone had raised a platform out of wagon planks and nail-bitten crates. A crowd gathered, boots scuffed thin, shoulders stooped by work and silence. Men had come to trade tools, cattle, and grain, but the last thing on offer was not a mule or a plow. It was a human being. She stood barefoot on the platform. Trail dust clung to her ankles. A torn length of burlap covered her head and mouth, sun-faded and wind-frayed, as if shame itself had stitched the mask in place. Her wrists were bound, rope digging deep, her hands trembling in small, controlled rhythms.
She had not spoken since they dragged her across Idaho. Only her eyes remained, gray-green, distant, offering nothing. The man running the sale wore a once red vest dulled by sweat and years. A rusted badge sagged on his chest, more for theater than law. He struck his gavel against the crate. "Last lot of the day," he called, voice loud enough to scrape against the buildings. "No name given, won't show her face. Says she'll work, says she'll obey. Who's fool enough to bid?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Bet she's pricklier than a cactus," someone shouted. "Or just a sack of laundry with opinions," another barked. The crowd jeered. A few men turned away, others leaned in closer, waiting for some drunk or desperate soul to take the chance. The woman did not move. Only the burlap shifted with her shallow breathing. The auctioneer frowned. "She's worth less than cattle if she won't even speak." Then the noise stilled. The crowd parted for a tall figure moving forward, boots heavy with dried mud, coat faded at the seams. His trail hat shadowed most of his face, but the width of his shoulders and the slow certainty of his steps gave him weight enough.
His left hand was wrapped with leather strips, the kind a rope leaves after years of use. He reached the front without hurry. His voice was quiet, but it carried. $1. The auctioneer blinked. "Don't you want to see what you're buying?" The man's gaze lifted to the veiled woman. She hadn't flinched, hadn't lifted her eyes from the horizon beyond the crowd. He said, steady as the mountains behind them, "I'm not buying a face, I'm taking a person." The crowd fell into silence. Even the wind seemed to pause in the pines. Somewhere deep in the hush, a verse of scripture stirred like an old memory. "We love because He first loved us." 1 John 4:19. And with those words, the ledger of Red Bluff turned to a new chapter, one that neither James Carver nor Eliza Whitaker yet understood. The auctioneer licked his lips, uneasy with the silence that followed. He glanced between the stranger and the bound woman, as if waiting for laughter to return, but none came. The men of Red Bluff, roughened by dust and whiskey, simply watched. "Name," the auctioneer asked. The tall man spoke without looking away from her. "James Carver, timber cutter."
"East o' here." The gavel came down hard against the crate. "Sold! $1." His voice faltered before he added, "Now, by law, you're husband and wife." He turned toward the veiled figure. "Name, miss, for the record." At first there was nothing, only the creak of leather, the restless shuffle of boots. Then, muffled behind the burlap, a voice emerged. Dry from silence, thin from dust, but steady enough to reach the edges of the crowd. "Eliza Whitaker." James's hand tightened briefly, then loosened at his side. He stepped forward, unhurried, and untied the coarse rope biting into her wrists. No one laughed now. The jeers had dried into a silence that felt older than the town itself. With her hands free, he helped her down from the platform.
The crowd parted without a word. Boots scraped against planks, spurs clicked, and the trail dust swallowed the moment whole. Together, they crossed the edge of Red Bluff, leaving behind the saloon doors, the clanging forge, the jeering faces now suddenly quiet. Beyond the last hitching post, the land tilted upward into pine and stone. The trail was narrow, beaten thin by wagons, then soft beneath the needles of long-armed pines. The farther they walked, the less the sun dared to break through the canopy. Wind carried resin and damp earth. A raven cut across the sky, its wings whispering above the treetops. James walked ahead, leading a mule burdened with supplies. He did not look back, nor did he hurry. Eliza followed a few steps behind, her head still veiled, her hands clasped tight before her, as if she were holding on to something invisible. Freedom did not yet feel like hers. An hour passed in silence. The sound of boots against soil, the creak of saddle leather, the muted breath of the forest, that was all. James's steps were steady, practiced, the rhythm of a man who had known long trails and longer nights. At last the woods opened into a clearing carved into the hillside. There stood his cabin, square-hewn timbers darkened by weather, a roof angled against the northern winds, a split-rail fence half-finished. A rusted horseshoe bent out of shape hung above the doorway, as though daring misfortune to try again. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though no fire burned within. A stack of wood leaned tall against the wall, each cut measured, each log squared like the man himself. James pushed the door open, then stepped aside. His voice, when it came, was low, almost shy. "No one here to tell you where to be anymore. This place is yours to choose." Eliza entered. She did not touch the table, the stove, or the cot. She walked to the farthest wall, crouched low with her back turned, her hands pressed to her knees. James hung his hat on a peg and bent to build a fire. Flame caught slow, warming the one-room cabin with flickers of light. He set a pot to boil, dropped in roots and meat, a pinch of spice carried from some trading post weeks past. The scent spread, smoke and salt, comfort rising into a silence that asked nothing of her. He ladled 2 bowls, one for himself, one placed gently near her on the floor. Then he sat, quiet, waiting. For the first time in years, Eliza Whittaker did not sit alone. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The town of Red Bluff shrank behind them in slow measure, its crooked buildings and drifting smoke fading into the gray of distance. James Carver set a steady pace, boots dark with trail mud. The weight of silence pressed into his shoulders like an old companion. He led a mule that carried supplies, flour, dried beans, timber tools wrapped in oilcloth. The animal followed without protest, as though it had walked this path 100 times. Eliza Whittaker walked a few paces behind. Her wrists were free now, though the skin showed red where rope had dug too long. She clasped her hands before her, the burlap veil still tied at her neck. Each step seemed chosen with care, as if freedom itself was unfamiliar ground. The trail bent east, then rose into a spine of pines. Their roots twisted through the dirt like the bones of some ancient beast. Sunlight thinned as branches interlaced above, weaving shadow into long ribbons across the ground. Ravens perched high, watching, their calls sharp and echoing. James did not speak. He had learned in war and in wilderness that silence often said more than words. His stride carried the weight of a man who had seen too much to waste motion. Each bootfall was a promise, forward, forward, without falter. Behind him, Eliza's breath came shallow but steady. She did not stumble, though her shoes were thin from travel. Her back remained straight, her head high despite the veil. If fear lived within her, it hid beneath the small precision of her movements. After some miles, the trail crossed a narrow creek. James paused, letting the mule drink. He did not look back, but he listened. The shuffle of her steps, the faint rush of water against stone, the fragile sound of her cloth shifting in the breeze. A soldier's instinct measured these details, the way one reads weather or the angle of falling snow.
They told him she was weary, but unbroken. They moved on. The air grew cooler as the pines thickened, resin sharp in their lungs. Somewhere distant, an axe rang against timber, another homesteader carting a life out of the forest. But here, on this trail, it was only the two of them. James's thoughts drifted as the hours passed. He remembered other marches, lines of men in Union blue, boots sinking into mud, faces hollowed by years of fighting. He had survived those days not by speaking, but by enduring. And now endurance was what he offered the woman who followed him. No questions, no demands, only the path ahead. At last, the land dipped into a shallow valley where the trees parted. A clearing opened like a secret kept from the world. Smoke curled faint from a chimney that rose above a square-cut cabin. The roof slanted strong against the mountain winds. A stack of firewood lined with precision against one wall. A rusted horseshoe hung crooked above the doorway, bent but still holding. James slowed. He rested a hand against the mule's bridle, then turned half toward her for the first time since leaving town. His voice was low, almost unsure, yet carried the weight of choice. "No one here will tell you where to stand, Eliza. The rest, that's yours to decide." She stopped at the edge of the clearing, veils stirring in the late mountain wind. For a long breath, she did not answer, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the first fragile note of something else, though neither yet dared to name it. The door groaned on its iron hinges as James pushed it open. The cabin smelled of timber, earth, and smoke that had long since faded from the hearth. It was small, built square against the wind, but the lines were strong. Corners well notched, floor swept, everything in its place. Inside, there was little to see. A cot tucked beneath the far wall, a table cut from thick pine, a single chair beside it. A stove stood near the hearth, its iron black with use. A tin basin rested on a shelf, beside a bundle of herbs hung to dry. This was no place of comfort, only of survival. But it was clean, steady, prepared. James stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. Eliza moved carefully, her bare feet whispering against the wood. She did not lift the veil, nor touch the walls. She crossed to the far corner, lowered herself to the floor, and drew her knees to her chest. Her silence was not defiance, but a defense. Without a word, James hung his trail hat on a peg by the door. He knelt by the stove, struck flint to steel, and coaxed a small flame to life. The fire caught, low at first, then stronger, warming the dim cabin with its flicker. He filled a pot with water, dropped in dried root, a strip of venison, a pinch of spice he'd traded for in town. The scent rose slow, filling the space with something that felt older than hunger. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 tin bowls. One he carried to the table. The other he set gently on the floor beside her, the steam rising between them. He did not speak, did not press. He simply placed it where she might take it, then returned to his seat. Minutes passed. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind shifted in the trees. At last, her voice came, muffled through the burlap. "What is this?" James stirred his own bowl once. "A meal," he said. Then, after a pause, "I used to make it for myself after the war. Long days with no one talking. Still, I made 2 bowls." She shifted, the burlap rustling faintly. Her head turned toward him, though she did not raise it. "2?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "Even when no one was there, I set one out. Reminded me I made it home, that I wasn't just talking to ghosts." His hand rested on the table, fingers loose, the habit of a soldier long unarmed. "My wife, she passed from fever. Spring came, but not for her. Still, I set the bowl just the same." Silence folded over the room. The only sound was her breath, quick and shallow. Then, at last, she reached for the bowl beside her. Her hand trembled as she lifted the spoon beneath the veil. The motions were slow, cautious. But she did not stop until the bowl was empty. James did not look at her. He washed his own dish in the tin basin, his movements steady, ordinary. Yet something had shifted in the cabin, something neither of them could name. It was not peace, not yet.
But it was the beginning of presence, the quiet knowledge that no one in that room was alone. Night came quick in the high country. Shadows deepened against the cabin walls, the fire snapping soft inside the stove. James sat on the edge of the cot, elbows braced on his knees, staring into the glow. He had not lit the lantern. Firelight was enough. Eliza had folded herself by the far wall again, her knees drawn to her chest. She did not remove the veil. Yet her posture was different than before, less like a prisoner, more like someone weighing choices she had not dared to hold for years. James rubbed his palms together, then stilled them in the heat. The crackle of wood pulled his mind backward, across seasons and miles, to the winter of '82, the harshest he had ever known. He had ridden too far north that year, pride carrying him past safe cut lines, chasing timber he could not afford to lose. Snow had fallen hard, biting through wool, burning skin with frost. He remembered the slip, the sudden give of ice beneath his boots. His leg twisted beneath him, sharp and final. By the time he dragged himself into a drift, the sky had turned white as bone. There was no trail left, no sound but the roar of wind. He thought then, this is how men vanish. And then, hands, rough, alive, urgent. He was dragged into the dark, the weight of another body straining against the storm. He collapsed into a cave where fire snapped against stone. Heat licked his frozen skin. Herbs boiled bitter in a tin cup. Across from him sat a woman. Her face was hidden beneath a sackcloth veil, drawn tight at the neck, only her eyes left to meet the world. They were gray-green, steady, unreadable. "You don't need to know who I am," she said, her voice a low ember against the howl of the storm. "But I'm not letting you die." She pressed the tin into his hands. Pine bark, dry lichen, drink. The taste had burned down his throat, but it kept his breath from slowing. She wrapped his leg, braced it with hot stones, fed the fire. Through fever and pain he drifted, caught between blackness and the faint sound of her voice, steady as snow falling. And then, silence. When he woke again, the cave was empty, fire still alive, herbs still set beside it. And folded with strange care was a square of cloth, no larger than a hand, stitched with uneven purple flowers. He had kept it. Through storms and seasons, through long rides and lonely nights, he had carried it in the lining of his coat. A reminder of a life spared, though no name had ever been given. Now, 5 years later, the firelight in his cabin flickered against the burlap veil of the woman who sat across from him. Her silence, her eyes, the weight of her presence. James slid his hand into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the cloth, worn soft by years. The flowers faded but unforgotten. He did not pull it out. He only held it, the way a man holds a truth too heavy to name. And in that moment, with fire crackling between them, James Carver knew the woman who had once dragged him from the mouth of death was sitting in his cabin still. The fire burned lower, throwing shadows that stretched long across the cabin walls. James sat quiet, the folded cloth hidden in his palm, the memory of that winter storm heavy in his chest. He did not speak of it. He only watched the coals breathe red and gold. Across the room, Eliza shifted. For hours she had sat veiled, her back to the wall, her silence like stone. But now her hands lifted, slow, deliberate, to the knot tied behind her neck. For a moment she held it there, as if deciding whether to loosen it at all. Then, with a small pull, the rope gave. The burlap slid upward, brushing against her hair, falling into her lap. Her face came into the firelight. James did not move, though his breath changed, caught in his chest. Her features were sharp, pale from years of shadow. But along the left side of her face, from temple to jaw, ran a scar deep and curved, the kind left not by accident, but by violence. It was healed, but it would never fade. Her eyes flicked toward him, quick, searching, for the recoil she had learned to expect. He gave none. His gaze did not flinch, did not harden. He only sat, waiting. Her voice came rough but steady.
"The man who ran the boarding house where I worked, he told me I could keep my room if I gave him more." Her hands twisted the burlap in her lap until her knuckles whitened. I said no. The fire cracked, the silence listening. He came at me. I fought back. He slipped, hit the stove. He didn't get up. She swallowed, the words catching in her throat. They said I lured him, said I planned it, called me a temptress, a killer, sold me off to pay his debts, covered my face so no one would see the scar, so they could decide my worth before I spoke a word. Her eyes burned now, not with tears, but with something harder. I didn't ask to be saved, and I didn't ask to be bought. James's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows heavy on his knees, his voice low. "You don't need to prove yourself to me." She blinked, caught off guard by the absence of judgment. He added, quieter still, "The world has its ways of condemning what it refuses to understand, but I won't be its echo." The fire popped, casting light across the scar that marked her but did not define her.
In the hush, a verse stirred like breath between them. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Matthew 7:1. Eliza looked down at the burlap in her lap, then back at the man across the fire. For the first time since Idaho, her eyes met another's without retreat. And in that meeting, something long buried began to rise. The fire burned low, filling the cabin with a soft amber glow. Eliza sat stiff against the wall, the burlap folded tight in her lap, her confession still trembling in the air. For a long while James said nothing. He did not rise, did not shift, did not offer hollow words. He simply stayed present, his silence steady as timber cut deep into earth. At last he moved. Slow, deliberate, he crossed the room to the small cedar chest near the cot. He lifted the lid and drew out something wrapped in cloth. When he returned to the fire, he set it gently on the table between them. Eliza's eyes flicked toward it, wary. James untied the cloth. Inside lay a mirror, oval, its silver edges dulled by years, its glass cleaned until it shone clear. He angled it toward the firelight. The reflection caught both flame and shadow, both scar and strength. Eliza stiffened, her hands tightening over the burlap. "Why? Show me this," she whispered, her voice raw. "Because hiding what's already survived does no justice to you," James answered. His tone was calm, not urging, not pitying, simply truth. Her breath hitched. For years she had avoided her reflection, knowing too well what others saw when they looked. She had not chosen to look again, until now. Until the mirror caught her face in firelight, scar and all. James reached once more into the cloth and pulled out a scarf. Silk, worn but still soft, faded to the color of desert dust. He folded it with care, then set it beside the mirror. "My wife used to wear this," he said. His voice thinned but steadied. Whenever she needed to feel like herself again. He paused, eyes resting on the scarf. She was braver than she knew, still is, even gone. Eliza stared at the silk, her throat tightening. "Why give it to me?" James leaned back, resting his forearms on his knees. "Because anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you lived through is blind, and the blind don't get to judge beauty." The words struck harder than she expected. Her fingers brushed the scarf, trembling, then lifted it slowly. The fabric slipped between her hands like river water, cool and light. She pressed it gently to her face, not to hide, but to feel the weight of something chosen, something given in trust. Her gaze drifted to the mirror. For a long breath she studied herself, the scar running from temple to jaw, the line that had once been her prison. But in the silk, under firelight, it looked less like ruin and more like proof. Her lips parted, barely above a whisper. Not shame. She paused, breath unsteady. Survival. James said nothing more. He only nodded once, a man who understood the worth of scars. And in that quiet cabin, the veil of burlap lay forgotten, while silk and reflection began to teach Eliza Whittaker the first fragile language of her own dignity. Morning came with pale light threading through the shutters. The forest woke slow, ravens calling from high limbs, the soft drip of dew from pine needles. Eliza rose from the cot, her hair loose, her movements unhurried. She did not reach for the burlap. It lay folded on the chair now, untouched since the night before.
She stepped outside with a tin pail, the ground cool beneath her feet. At the edge of the clearing, a narrow stream bent through the trees. She knelt, dipping the pail, watching ripples scatter across the surface. For the first time in years, the sound of water did not echo with chains, but with promise. Back at the cabin, James was already at work splitting wood. His axe rose and fell with measured rhythm, each strike splitting the log clean. He did not pause when she returned, only glanced once, an acknowledgment, not a command. She carried the pail to the basin, filled it, then set about washing a length of cloth with careful hands. The hours unfolded in quiet labor. She stitched a seam in her dress with thread pulled from an old spool. He sharpened his saw, oiling the teeth with precision. They spoke little, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a space where trust could grow, steady and unforced. At midday, James leaned his axe against the wall and wiped his brow. He looked out toward the ridgeline, where clouds were gathering slow. "I wouldn't have made it through the winter of '79, he said, voice low, "if not for a crow family up near the Yellowstone. I was hungry near to bone. They gave me cornmeal and dried fish, asked nothing back." Eliza looked up from her stitching. "Why?" He shrugged, the motion heavy with memory. "Because they could. Because compassion doesn't always need a reason." Her needle stilled, the words settling over her like the weight of the scarf she now wore at her shoulders. She thought of all the hands that had bound her, all the voices that had sold her, and how one act of kindness could still burn against the darkness of 100 cruelties. In the afternoon, she hung washed linen on a line strung between 2 pines. The fabric swayed in the breeze, pale against the dark forest. James stood nearby, repairing the latch on the cabin door. Neither spoke, yet when their eyes met, something passed unspoken, an understanding that both were learning how to stay rather than how to run. As evening fell, the cabin glowed warm again with firelight. James ladled stew into 2 bowls, setting one across from him at the table this time, not on the floor. Eliza hesitated, then crossed the room and took the seat. She lifted the spoon with steady hands. It was a small thing, a simple act of eating at a table. But in the wilderness, where survival was measured in both food and faith, it was as profound as any vow. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like breath, carrying with it the quiet truth that healing does not come all at once. It comes in rhythms, fetching water, splitting wood, stitching cloth, sharing a meal, until one day what was once broken no longer feels like it must hide. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The saloon at Red Bluff breathed smoke and sweat, its floorboards creaking beneath boots worn down by trail miles. A poker game muttered in the corner, glasses clinked at the bar, and the air smelled of whiskey sharp enough to cut. Then the doors swung wide. Silas Kane stepped inside. He was lean, his long duster torn at the shoulders, the brim of his hat pulled low. Dust clung to him as though it belonged there, settled deep in the seams of his coat. His eyes, gray, flat, and restless, moved like blades, scanning the room as if every man were a ledger to be read. He ordered nothing at first, just leaned against the bar, letting silence do the work. Then, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, he asked, "Any of you heard about a scarred woman? Might have come through here. Quiet type, face half hidden." The room shifted, cards stilled, boots scraped. Men who had laughed loud a moment ago now glanced at one another, uneasy. In a town where gossip traveled faster than wagons, they had all heard fragments about the auction weeks back, about the stranger who bought a woman for $1. Silas's smile sharpened. I heard she killed a man, lured him, burned him on the stove, then ran. Folks say she's dangerous, that she hides her face for a reason. Someone spat into the sawdust. Another muttered, stranger east o' here took her. Carver, quiet fellow, keeps to himself. Silas tapped the counter, satisfied. Carver, you say? The bartender, polishing a glass, frowned. You looking for trouble, Kane? Trouble? Silas chuckled, low and dry. No, just looking for justice. A woman like that shouldn't be left to roam free. Men died for less. The words crawled through the saloon like smoke. No one challenged him. Few believed entirely, but rumor was a seed that needed little soil, and Silas Kane knew how to plant it well. He downed a shot of rye, tossed a coin on the counter, and straightened. East, you said? Into the timber? The room stayed quiet. Silas tipped his hat, eyes narrowing as if he could already see the trail. Much obliged. He turned, boots thudding across the boards, and pushed back into the street where the wind carried dust low between the buildings. Behind him, talk began again, but softer, heavier. Men muttered of the scar, of the woman hidden, of Carver's silence. The story twisted with each telling, growing darker, sharper. By nightfall, Red Bluff was a town carrying more rumor than truth. And out in the timber, where the pines stood watch, James Carver and Eliza Whitaker had no knowledge yet that the storm was already riding toward them. The sky pressed low with gray by the time James returned from Red Bluff. His mule carried flour, salt, a coil of rope, ordinary things for ordinary living, but his face was not the same as when he left. Eliza was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She looked up as the door opened, the scarf loose around her shoulders. You're late. James set the sack of supplies down heavier than he meant to.
For a moment he stood in the doorway, hat still in his hand, as if words might betray him before he spoke them. Then he said, Lo, there's a man asking about you. The spoon stilled in her hand. Who? Name's Silas Kane. Rode into town this morning. Told the saloon you killed a man. Said you're dangerous. That you hide your face for good reason. James's jaw tightened, the muscles shifting like stone beneath skin. He's hunting you. The air inside the cabin thickened. The fire snapped. The stew hissed, but all else held still. Eliza lowered the spoon, her hand trembling just once before she steadied it against the pot. Her voice was quiet, almost flat. The past always finds a way. James crossed the room, leaning against the table. He looked at her, not with doubt, but with something heavier. You told me what happened. I believe you, but belief won't stop him from coming. Her eyes met his. They were not the eyes of a woman ready to flee again. What will you do? For a moment he said nothing. He thought of winter survived, of the cloth stitched with purple flowers he still carried in his coat, of the way she had sat at this very table and chosen to lift a spoon instead of vanish into silence. At last he answered, What we both must. Her brow furrowed. Both? I won't have you running any more. His voice was steady now, the quiet of a man who had already decided. If he's coming, we face him here, together. Eliza looked down at her hands. The burlap sack still lay folded in the cedar chest, its edges frayed from years of wear. For so long it had been her shield, her prison. Now it sat waiting like a question. She closed her eyes briefly, the firelight painting her scar in soft glow. Then it's time, she whispered. James watched her, unsure of what she meant, but certain of one thing. Whatever choice she made now would be her own, and it would change everything. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying with it the scent of storm and the promise of confrontation. The storm lamps flickered in the cabin, shadows stretching across rough-hewn walls. Eliza stood by the cedar chest, her hand resting on the folded burlap.
For a long time she did not move, only stared at it as though it were a relic from another life. James watched from the table, arms braced, his face unreadable. At last she lifted the sack, held it in both hands, and said, "I'll wear it again." His jaw tightened. "You don't have to." Her eyes rose to meet his. There was no fear in them, only steady resolve. "I choose it, not to hide, to move unseen, to end this." The words fell like iron into the room. For years the burlap had been forced on her, a symbol of shame. Now, in her hands, it became something else, a weapon, a mask she wielded rather than endured. James exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Then we make it count." They spread a map across the table, a sheet worn soft at the edges. James traced the trail with a calloused finger, leading east through the timber. The canyon narrows here, between two ridges. No room to turn a horse fast. Sheriff's men can set up along the rocks. If Kane follows, he'll have nowhere to run. Eliza studied the lines, the rough ink marking rivers and ridges. "And he'll follow," she said quietly. "A woman veiled, riding alone, he won't resist." Her voice held no bitterness, only certainty.
She understood the way men like Silas thought, how they fed on weakness they imagined, how they underestimated what they could not see. James looked at her, his eyes heavy with something beyond concern, respect, maybe even awe. It's a dangerous gamble. She tied the sack loose at her neck, the knot familiar, the fabric rough against her skin. Yet for the first time it did not choke. She straightened her spine, shoulders squared. So is living afraid. The silence that followed was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was the stillness before a storm, before a choice that could not be unmade. James rolled the map, tucked it into his coat, then reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. He checked the chamber, the sound of metal closing sharp in the quiet cabin. We ride at first light. Eliza lowered the sack over her face. The world dimmed, edges blurred, but her heart steadied. She had worn this cloth as a curse, as a prison. Now, for the first time, it was armor of her own making. And in that moment, with firelight burning low, the woman who had once been sold in silence became the hunter of her own freedom. The morning broke pale and cold. Mist curled low across the timber. Eliza tightened the knot at her neck, the burlap settling over her face. The fabric scratched against her skin, but her hands were steady. She swung into the saddle of James's bay gelding, the leather creaking beneath her weight. James stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle slung across his back, jaw set hard. "Straight east," he said. "Stay to the canyon. He'll come after you. Don't look back." She gave one short nod. For years, men had told her where to stand, how to move, when to speak. This time, the choice was hers. The gelding's hooves struck the earth, carrying her into the shadow of pines. The forest swallowed her whole, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats behind. Hours later, Silas Kane picked up the trail. He had been waiting, circling the ridges east of town, and now dust marked her passage plain as ink on parchment. His smile was thin as a knife. "A sack over her head," he muttered, still running. He spurred his horse forward, hungry with the chase. Branches clawed at his coat, rocks jarred his boots in the stirrups, but his eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead. Eliza felt him before she heard him. The forest carried sound in strange ways, the snap of a twig, the faint cry of a crow startled into flight. Her heart quickened, but she did not falter. The canyon lay ahead, its stone walls narrowing like jaws. At the ridgeline above, Sheriff Harlan crouched with 2 deputies, rifles braced against rock. James knelt beside them, his eyes locked on the trail winding below.
Sweat dampened his collar despite the morning chill. Then came the echo of hooves, fast, relentless. Silas rode hard, his coat snapping behind him, dust spiraling from his horse's stride. He leaned forward in the saddle, every muscle straining toward the veiled figure ahead. Eliza entered the canyon. She slowed just enough to keep him hungry, just enough to bait him deeper. The stone walls rose higher, shadows pooling at their base. Her hands tightened on the reins, pulse pounding in her ears. James's grip on his rifle whitened. He could see her now, small against the rock, the sack stark in the gray light. Behind her thundered Silas, teeth bared in a grin that mistook pursuit for victory. The sheriff lifted a hand. "Not yet," he whispered. Dust rose in plumes, choking the air.
The canyon funneled the sound until every hoofbeat rang like a drum. Eliza kept her eyes fixed forward. She had been hunted before, but never like this, never by choice. When Silas crossed the midpoint, the sheriff's hand dropped. Rifles cocked. The trap was sprung. The canyon held its breath. Stone walls funneled dust into the air, hooves pounding like thunder trapped between ridges. Eliza kept her horse steady, not daring to look back. She could feel Silas closing, the hunger of his pursuit pressing against her spine. From above, James's rifle tracked every stride. Sheriff Harlan raised 2 fingers, steady, wait, while the deputies kept their sights fixed on the rider below. Silas Kane saw only the figure ahead, a veiled woman, small against the stone, fleeing. He bared his teeth, spurred his horse harder, and shouted, "You can't run forever!" Eliza's jaw tightened beneath the sack. She did not answer. She rode straight, drawing him deeper into the canyon's jaws. Then the sheriff's hand dropped. A crack split the air as a rifle fired warning into the dirt just ahead of Silas's horse. The animal reared, screaming, nearly throwing its rider.
Silas wrenched the reins, cursing, and his pistol came up in a flash of steel. James's heart seized. He had lived through enough battlefields to know the instant before lead flew. He shouted down, voice rough, "Don't!" Silas fired. The shot ricocheted off stone, sparks biting the air. In the same breath, 3 rifles answered. Bullets chewed into the ground near his boots, the canyon exploding with echo. Silas's pistol spun from his hand, clattering into the dust. "Down!" the sheriff roared. "Hands where we see 'em!" Silas snarled, clutching his wrist, but he was outnumbered. Deputies scrambled from the ridge, rifles trained. James descended last, his boots hard against stone, rifle leveled steady as he closed the distance. Eliza had drawn her horse aside, out of the line of fire. Her breath came ragged, but her spine remained unbroken. She lifted the burlap, pulling it free from her face, and for the first time she looked straight at the man who had hunted her. Silas froze. The scar caught the light, a brutal mark carved from temple to jaw. His sneer faltered, replaced with something closer to disbelief.
"This is the monster you chase?" James growled, stepping close, pressing the barrel of his rifle against Silas's chest. "A woman who's done nothing but survive what men like you forced upon her?" The sheriff bound Silas's hands tight behind his back, yanking him down from the saddle. Dust billowed as the outlaw hit the ground, cursing through his teeth. Silas spat at Eliza's feet. "They'll never see you as anything but ruined. You'll always be the scar." Her eyes did not waver. For the first time, she spoke not as prey, but as one who had endured. "Then let them look. Truth is not yours to bury." And as the canyon walls carried her words into silence, a verse rose clear as mountain wind. "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. James lowered his rifle. The deputies dragged Silas to his horse, bound and beaten. Eliza drew a long breath. For the first time since she had spoken her name, the air filled her lungs without weight. The canyon lay still after the gunfire. Dust drifted in pale clouds, settling over stone and horse alike.
Silas Kane struggled against the rope binding his wrists, curses spilling through clenched teeth. But Sheriff Harlan jerked him upright with no patience for protest. "You'll answer to Helena," the sheriff said, voice hard as granite. "Not here, not in whispers and rumor, but in court where truth weighs heavier than lies." The deputy slung Silas across his own horse like a sack of grain. His hat fell into the dirt, trampled beneath hooves as they turned him toward the westward trail. For all his threats, his gray eyes now carried only venom without power. James stood watching, rifle lowered but still in hand. He waited until the posse rode out of the canyon before he let his shoulders ease. His breath came deep, drawn like a man surfacing from water. Eliza remained astride the bay gelding, her veil gone, her face bare to the morning light. She did not tremble. She only sat tall in the saddle, eyes following the path where Silas disappeared. At last she said, quiet but certain, "It's done." James looked up at her. "The man's caught, but still follows," she finished for him. Her voice did not falter.
But so does truth. They left the canyon slow, the echo of pursuit fading behind them. The trail climbed back into the timber, the pines whispering in the wind, as though the forest itself had witnessed the judgment. Ravens circled above, not in omen, but in release, their wings cutting arcs of freedom in the sky. By the time the cabin came into view, smoke curled from the chimney, steady and thin. Eliza dismounted, her legs unsteady only from the long ride, not from fear. James unsaddled the gelding, patting its neck with rough affection. Neither spoke for some time. The silence now was not sharp with dread, but soft with exhaustion, the kind that follows a battle endured. That evening, as they shared bread and broth at the table, Sheriff Harlan returned. His horse sweated from the hard ride, but his face carried a weight different from before. He reached into his coat and drew out a sealed envelope, rough from travel. "This came down from Helena," he said, setting it on the table. "Letter from Martha Collins. Claims she saw what happened in that boarding house kitchen. Said she stayed silent out of fear. Too long."
"But she's sworn it now, signed it proper." Eliza froze, the spoon slipping from her hand. For years she had carried the burden of silence, of others looking away. Now, across parchment and ink, another woman's truth had finally stepped forward. The sheriff nodded once. "Justice moves slow, but it moves." When he left, the cabin door shut against the night. Eliza sat staring at the envelope, her hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of release. James reached across the table, covering her fingers with his own. For the first time, she did not pull away. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Dawn broke soft across the pines, gold spilling through the branches like a slow blessing. The forest was quiet, but not empty, the kind of silence that carried life instead of fear. James had risen early, splitting wood in the clearing, the sound of axe meeting logs steady and sure. Inside, Eliza sat at the table, the sealed letter from Helena still resting before her. She had opened it the night before, read the words until the ink seemed etched into her bones. "All charges dismissed, case closed, warrant rescinded. Martha Collins's testimony had spoken plain. She had seen what happened in that kitchen, had watched the struggle, had seen the fall. Fear had bound her tongue for years, but now she had signed her truth, and in doing so, she had given Eliza back her name. The paper lay folded neatly, no longer a threat, but a declaration. Eliza touched it once, her fingers lingering over the crease, then set it aside. She rose and crossed the room to the cedar chest. Inside, folded tight, lay the burlap sack. She lifted it slowly, the fabric rough in her hands. For years it had been a curse, a prison stitched of shame. Now it was something else, a witness, silent but undeniable, to all she had endured.
James entered just as she held it up, his brow furrowed. "You don't need that anymore." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "I know. That's why I'll keep it, not as burden, but as testament." He tilted his head, uncertain. A testament to what? She folded the cloth once, twice, pressing it flat against her palms. Her voice steadied. "That what once bound me has no power now.
That I choose what remains." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he set the axe aside, wiped his hands, and stepped closer. His voice softened. "You've walked further than most men I knew in war, and you walked it with no one beside you, till now." Her eyes lifted to his. For the first time, she did not lower them. Later that morning, she washed the sack in the stream, let the mountain sun bleach it pale. With needle and thread, she mended its edges, not to disguise, but to mark transformation. In each corner, she stitched small purple wildflowers, the same uneven shape she remembered from the cloth James had once carried, left behind in a winter cave. The past had come full circle, not as curse, but as proof of survival shared. By afternoon, the sack no longer looked like something meant to erase a face. Draped across the back of a chair, it resembled fabric claimed, reshaped by her hands into something new. That evening, James brought her a gift. On the table lay a small mirror, its silver edges worn but polished clean. He propped it where the last light of day poured across it. Beside it, folded with care, rested the silk scarf that had once belonged to his wife.
Eliza touched the scarf gently, her thumb brushing the faded fabric. "Why give me this?" "Because it carried her strength once," James said. His eyes were steady, voice low. "And now it may carry yours, not to hide, to remind." She lifted the mirror, angling it toward the fading light. For years she had avoided reflection, had lived beneath burlap rather than her own face. Now, for the first time, she looked straight. The scar traced its line from temple to jaw, deep and undeniable. But she did not recoil. Her hand rose, fingers brushing the mark with the tenderness one might give a medal, not a wound. She lowered the mirror, her voice steady. "It is not what ruined me. It is what I lived through." James reached across the table, his hand closing gently over hers. She did not pull away. The fire in the stove burned low, filling the cabin with warmth not born of fear, but of something earned. Outside, the forest carried the sound of water over stone, steady and unbroken. And within those walls, Eliza Whittaker allowed herself, at last, to begin again. Spring ripened across the Montana hills, the snowmelt feeding streams that rushed brighter each day. The clearing near James's cabin softened with green, wildflowers pushing up through stone. The arch he had built stood at the edge, beams squared firm, a length of white linen draped from its crossbar. Word had spread, not through posters or proclamations, but by whispers that carried where they were meant to go. When the day came, those who mattered arrived. Sheriff Harlan with his weathered hat in hand, Anna Turner in a plain cotton dress carrying yellow bells, the blacksmith bearing a jug of applejack, and the baker with a loaf wrapped in calico. Not many, but enough. Inside the cabin, Eliza stood before the mirror. Her dress was simple muslin, cream-colored and hand-stitched by her own labor. Around her shoulders lay the faded silk scarf James had given her, but atop her head rested something wholly her own, the sack reborn. She had washed it, mended its edges, and embroidered purple wildflowers at its corners. Draped now as a veil, it no longer carried the weight of shame. It looked instead like a crown shaped from survival. Her breath trembled once, not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment.
She touched the veil lightly, fingers lingering on the flowers stitched into its edge. Then she turned to the door. The forest quieted as she stepped into the clearing. James stood beneath the arch, his boots polished, his shirt scrubbed clean, his hair combed back in a way that made him look both solemn and young. His hands hung steady at his sides, but when he saw her, his eyes softened, the silence between them speaking louder than any vow. Eliza walked toward him, each step deliberate, her veil shifting in the wind. She did not move like a woman being given away, but like one walking into a choice fully her own. When she reached him, James took her hands. His voice carried only to her, though the forest held every word. No matter the cover, no matter the scar, you are the woman I chose then, and the woman I vow to stand beside now, to the end. Her lips curved, her voice low but steady. And I vow the same, not as someone hidden, not as someone hunted, but as myself, Eliza Whitaker. There was no preacher, no scripture spoken aloud, but in the hush beneath the pines it felt sanctified all the same. When they kissed, it was not the hesitant touch of survival, but the sure joining of two lives no longer running. Above them, the linen caught the wind like a sail ready to carry them forward. A few drops of rain fell, light as breath, mingling with laughter, as Anna whispered to the blacksmith, "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turn to a wedding veil." The old man chuckled. "Ain't the sack," he said, "it's what she made of it." That night, after the guests had gone, James and Eliza sat side by side on the porch. The veil lay folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the stitched wildflowers. The stars shone clear above, the forest breathing calm around them. She leaned into him, her voice soft but certain. "This used to mean everything I feared. Now," she lifted the veil slightly, the embroidery catching starlight, "now it means everything I chose." James reached for her hand. Their fingers wove together, not as savior and saved, but as equals, bound by choice and faith. The woods, once a place of shadows and silence, now held them gently, like a home earned rather than given. And so, beneath the tall pines, with a veil born of shame turned into a crown of her own making, Eliza Whitaker and James Carver found what so many on the frontier never did: peace. Not in forgetting, not in erasing the scars, but in reclaiming them, and in turning survival into blessing. Out here, where the pines whisper and the dust still clings to forgotten trails, stories like Eliza and James's remind us that the frontier was never only about guns and grit. It was about endurance, compassion, and the quiet courage to keep walking forward. Perhaps you, too, carry scars unseen by the world. Perhaps you know what it is to be misjudged, or to carry silence longer than you wished. Their journey is a mirror, not just of survival, but of redemption. A reminder that faith, love, and human dignity can rise even from the harshest soil. These are the true Wild West stories worth keeping alive, not just of outlaws and gunsmoke, but of hearts tested and hope reclaimed. If this story touched you, share it, leave your thoughts below, and join us as we bring more forgotten voices of the frontier back into the light.